Welcome back to Kings of the North. We're talking Super Bowl on the show. If you don't know the Super Bowl, what day is Super Bowl, Land? It's Sunday. Sunday afternoon, and we're talking about, of course, Northern players in the Super Bowl. So we are going to talk to some experts. A couple of you guys who watch the show, follow the show, and say, hey, have on some more experts. We have on 3 reporters who covered in college Northern players who you will be watching in the Super Bowl on Sunday. So we are going to talk to Chad Leistikow. It's not Leistikow, it's Leistikow. I made myself say it right, then I said it wrong. Anyway, Chad Leistikow about former Iowa tight end, now the San Francisco 49ers, George Kittle. We're going to talk to Steve Politi about former Rutgers running back Isiah Pacheco, now, of course, with the Chiefs. And then Eric Hansen talking about former Notre Dame linebacker Drue Tranquill, now with Kansas City. Again, like 3 interesting dudes. And then at the end, Landis, you and I are going to talk about 2 Ohio State guys playing in this game, Nick Bosa and Chase Young, former defensive end partners in Columbus, now in San Francisco. But we want to start off by talking about how there's more Northern stuff in this game than people will give credit for. I counted up the top 35 players on each roster. This is like my new formula for everything, right? It really cuts off. There's usually it's like 17 or 18 guys on each side of the ball. So for the 49ers and Chiefs, I counted up the top 35 players for each, 70 total players. I broke them down by how many went to Northern colleges, how many went to Southern colleges, and then I had a group of like California schools and border colleges that sometimes, if I don't count a guy in the North, I feel like people think I count him for the South. I don't want to give the South credit for Stanford guys, but also we don't count Stanford in the North. So North, South, and California/border. How many Northern guys out of the 70, right? 35 on each team. How many Northern college players do you think in this game?
28.
30. See, underestimating the North. Once again, Bill Landis.
Sorry.
34 from the South, but there's more Southern schools that we count, and then 6 from border or California schools. This I found interesting. Now talking about Northern starters, okay? There are 12 Northern starters for the 49ers, so more than half their players are from the North. 9 Northern starters for Kansas City, plus the San Francisco punter and kicker are Northern guys, so I'm throwing them in here. So that's 23 overall guys. I'm trying to make a point here about Northern guys being underrated. There's a lot of stats. People love stats for the Super Bowl. Maybe we'll do a Squares thing. Should we do a Squares thing for Kings of the North and people can gamble with us and give us money?
I'll take their money.
You run it? Yeah. All right. Send your money to Landis. Yeah. This is by round. The Northern players, those 23 guys, 5 in the first round, 2 second rounders, 4 third rounders, 3 fourth rounders, 5 fifth rounders, none in the 6th, 3 in the 7th, and a free agent. So there are 23 guys who are basically starters in this game in the Super Bowl from the North. Only 5 of them were drafted in the first round. Bill, why do people hate Northern college football players? Isn't that crazy?
It's because Kings of the North didn't exist prior to
changing
this upcoming draft.
Changing minds and changing lives. So I just want to, is that too much? Do I pound this table too hard? Is this ridiculous? Are we past the point of nobody cares? Or would you sit down and think oh man, I'm sure everybody in the Super Bowl went to Georgia or LSU?
No, I actually think it's interesting because I think a lot of people would assume that everyone in the Super Bowl went to Georgia or LSU or Ohio State, but we're not even, when we talk about all the Northern players, 2 of them are from Ohio State. Right?
Yeah. So I have the list. So these are all the guys, right, who were in that Northern list that I was talking about. All these Northern players by school. Ready? We claim 26 schools as our power conference schools in the North. 17 of our 26 schools are represented in the Super Bowl. Okay? 3 from Penn State, 3 from Michigan, 2 from Oregon, 2 from Ohio State, 2 from Rutgers, 2 from Cincinnati, 2 from Notre Dame, and then 1 each from Nebraska, Washington, Purdue, Wisconsin, West Virginia, Iowa State, Iowa, BYU, Colorado, and Utah. Congratulations to all them. Now, we also have 5 other Northern schools that are not among our 26 that also have players, including 2 from Western Michigan.
Sky Moore and who else?
Another guy.
Oh.
1 from Washington State, 1 from Harvard, 1 from Penn, and 1 from Wyoming. So those are all of our Northern guys.
There's somebody from Penn in the Super Bowl?
From Penn,
that?
Justin Watson, the Kansas City receiver, went to Penn. And then
that?
Kyle Juszczyk, the Niners fullback, went to Harvard. Everybody talks about that guy.
Yeah.
Harvard football. Sick of Harvard football. God, all they talk about is football. Harvard this and Harvard that. So I just want to note that. And I want to note that there are like really guys that matter in this game. Colton McKivitz, I'm not really familiar with him, but he's the right tackle for the Chiefs. He went to West Virginia. He was a 4-year starter at West Virginia. Awesome. Like Jair Brown, great Penn State safety, new to the league, was great at Penn State.
Yeah.
Important dude for the Niners. There's just guys there's guys all over the place. Actually, McKivitz is for the 49ers. I might have said the Chiefs. Donovan Smith from Penn State is a left tackle for the Chiefs. Huge deal that time. George Karlaftis from Purdue, defensive end. I don't know. Trent McDuffie, great corner from Washington in this game. So anyway, props to the North. Is that a show? Props to the North.
Props to the North.
Props to the North.
Plus, Trent McDuffie's going to win MVP. I put a bet on that. So
you did?
Yeah. I like betting on defensive players for MVP.
I love it. So again, 30 of the top 35 guys is number of snaps. A couple of the guys are hurt or whatever, you might not show, but like 30 of the 70 are from the North. Okay. So that's the point. Now I want to play a game. I don't know if you want to play this game.
You're going to make me name all of them?
I'm going to name them. So this game is called Super Bowl Quarterbacks. This is Super Bowl 58. So we've had 57 previous Super Bowls. I counted up number of Super Bowl wins by starting quarterback.
Okay.
57 Super Bowls. There's the South, there's the North, and then there's the California and border schools. Okay. So it's 3 regional groups. How many Super Bowl wins for Northern starting quarterbacks out of 57, would you guess?
32.
25.
Okay.
But that still is the most. The South has 19. And the South got off to a good start because the first 3 Super Bowl wins were by Alabama quarterbacks because it was Bart Starr, Joe Namath. You know, so it's like, hey, so the South blew its lead. And then there's like this California stuff is like, I'm not going to give like the South credit for a UCLA quarterback. They don't get credit for Troy Aikman. They don't get credit for John Elway. They don't get credit for Jim Plunkett. Like, that's why I'm breaking off California here. 13 for border schools in California. Okay. 25 North, 19 South, 13 for California. So Brock Purdy from Iowa State, 14 different quarterbacks have won those 25 Northern Super Bowls. Okay.
Yeah.
Brock Purdy would be the 15th. Bill Landis named those quarterbacks.
Name the 14 quarterbacks?
Name the 14 Northern quarterbacks. I don't do this to embarrass you, but I want the people along at home to be able to play along. And play their Super Bowl games. So get the ideas in your head. You need to pause it right now. Pause it. Try to make your list. See how many of the 14 you can get. And then you have 30 seconds. No, so you have to go get your child from daycare, though. So you do have a time limit. Name as many as you can. They're pretty famous, frankly. They won the Super Bowl, for God's sake. Come on, Landis.
Tom Brady.
Tom Brady has 7.
Yeah.
So Tom Brady in Michigan, they have 7. That is 1.
Russell Wilson's won one, right?
Russell Wilson, we count him from Wisconsin, even though he only played there for 1 year. Sorry to NC State. For Russell Wilson, 1 for Wisconsin.
That was worth it too.
Wow. You are not great at this.
No, I feel like my brain doesn't function the way that it used to. I don't know. I'm gonna need hints.
Okay. 3 different Purdue quarterbacks have won a Super Bowl.
Okay, so Drew Brees.
Drew Brees won 1.
I don't know that I would name the other 2. I don't think I could.
Bob Greasy won 2 with the Dolphins. Okay. Brian Greasy's dad. And Len Dawson, that guy who was smoking in the locker room at halftime for the Chiefs.
Oh, I actually didn't know Len Dawson went to Purdue.
Yeah, Len Dawson went to Purdue.
I met him one time. Very nice man.
Why'd you meet him?
There was like a Hall of Fame celebration thing in Cleveland a couple years ago, and I covered it for Cleveland.com, and I like interviewed Len Dawson for like a half hour. He was truly like one of the nicest men I've ever met in my life.
Wow. All right. Congrats to that guy. 2 Notre Dame quarterbacks. One of them super famous. Who's the most famous quarterback that's not Tom Brady? The most famous Super Bowl quarterback?
Joe Montana.
Joe Montana went to Notre Dame. He has 4. And then the other guy is famous for breaking his leg.
Oh, Joe Theismann.
Joe Theismann went to Notre Dame. So that's 5 for Notre Dame total. 2 BYU quarterbacks.
Steve Young.
Steve Young. And the guy with the headband.
Jim McMahon.
Jim McMahon. Miami of Ohio, one guy, two Super Bowls.
Ben Roethlisberger.
Ben Roethlisberger. Delaware has one.
Joe Flacco.
West Virginia has one. I don't know if you'll get this.
I don't know that one.
Jeff Hostetler.
Oh.
Started his career at Penn State, transferred to West Virginia, had to play because Phil Simms got hurt that year for the Giants. Jeff Hostetler. Washington State, kind of a tough one.
I don't know that one.
Mark Rippon. And this one, Northern Iowa. They made a movie about him bagging groceries.
Oh, Kurt Warner.
Kurt Warner. So those are your 14 Northern Super Bowl quarterbacks. I don't know who the South ones are.
Can I get some credit for getting them with those hints at least? I know people could have named them without
name
the
that grocery bagger.
Name that grocery
headband
bagger
guy.
Yeah.
So Brock Purdy can join the list of Northern legends if he wins this thing. So good luck to the North, because Patrick Mahomes went to Texas Tech. So we don't.
Was he born in Texas? Was he born in the North?
His dad pitched for the Twins, so we might have a backdoor to claim Patrick Mahomes if we really try. All right, so we are going to go now. Let's start with our George Kittle interview. Again, it's Chad Leistikow talking about George Kittle. Then we will move into Isiah Pacheco with Steve Politi, and then we will move into Drue Tranquill with Eric Hansen. It's a lot of these guys. All of those guys were lower round draft picks. Tranquill's a 4th rounder. Pacheco's a 7th rounder. Kittle's a 5th rounder. Again, we went through the list of Northern guys. A lot of these guys who were playing in the Super Bowl, like Nick Bosa was a 1st rounder, and Trent McDuffie was a 1st rounder, and Eric Armstead was a 1st rounder. But a lot of them weren't, man. And they were good Northern college football players who kind of had to find their way in the NFL. And we want to tell their stories here on Kings of the North. After we talk to all those great reporters, Bill and I will be back at the end to talk a little bit about Chase Young and Nick Bosa. We'll do all that next on Kings of the North. All right, now time for some George Kittle talk. And we might talk about all the Iowa tight ends, but George Kittle playing in the Super Bowl for the San Francisco 49ers. And we have Chad Leistikow, who has been covering Iowa football for how long now, Chad?
Well, if the short story is I've been back on the beat since the end of the 14 season for the Des Moines Register. I covered the team back in the 90s for some other outlets. Went away for a while, worked with your friend Nate Ryan at USA Today.
The best.
He is the best. He truly is. And he says great things about you. But now, I've been back on the Hawkeye beat almost a decade now.
Awesome. So we could just read your story. And people can find this at hawkcentral.com, which is where all your Iowa coverage for the Register is. This headline it's from the last time George Kittle was in the Super Bowl. So 4 years ago, inside George Kittle's transformation from solid Iowa player to 49er superstar. So we are curious about how these Northern guys got to the Super Bowl, right? But the idea, even how George Kittle got to Iowa is ridiculous. He's born of Iowa sports royalty, but he has to, I didn't know any of this stuff. He has to backdoor his scholarship offer at the last second. Chad, how did Kittle even become a Hawkeye?
Yeah, I mean, his story is so crazy even before that, because his father was an assistant coach at Wisconsin. So he was born in a hospital that overlooked Camp Randall Stadium. So, perfect for Kings of the North, right? So, he was a skinny 6'2", 190-pound wide receiver in Norman, Oklahoma, because he was coaching for under Bob Stoops. His dad was. So that's why he's from Norman, Oklahoma. But he was a run-heavy system in high school. So he had get very little recruiting attention. Again, skinny kid, not a lot of production. He had an offer to Weber State. Now, of course, Iowa knew about him because of the Kittle ties. His father played offensive line at Iowa. And then they get to signing day. So this is all the way back when signing day was in February. Way back when.
Oh, those are good old days.
Yeah. So Kirk Ferentz tells George that if 2 other guys don't commit to us, you're our 3rd guy, basically. And he wanted to go to Iowa, of course. He knew about his father played at Iowa. This would be a major step up from Weber State. So he goes to school on signing day, wears a Hawkeye T-shirt under his clothes, hoping for the best. And, of course, we know the story now. He gets the scholarship offer that day, basically comes into Iowa as an afterthought. So it's not like Iowa, zeroed in on him and it's you're our guy. And then, as we'll get into, his Iowa career was pretty unspectacular for the most part. but it was just kind of development little by little, personality wise as well, to where he is now.
So like, that's the thing. He came in as an afterthought. Like, and I love those kind of recruiting stories, right? Everybody does. Everybody's like, recruiting doesn't matter. But well, recruiting does matter. Ratings do matter. But sometimes there's a little serendipity and stuff happens. He almost leaves Iowa as an afterthought in some ways. And I will read the stats here that, Chad, you have these memorized. But 2013, his first year, 5 catches, 108 yards. 2014, his second year, 1 catch, 25 yards. 2015, his third year, breaks out a little bit, 20 catches, 290 yards. Then 2016, right in your story, they're maybe going to try to use him a little bit more, but he has an injury or something. 22 catches, 314 yards. He leaves Iowa with 48 catches for 737 yards. So was this a guy when he's leaving Iowa, was like, oh man, this guy's going to tear up the NFL? Or was it like, this guy kind of, it never quite happened for him?
Good question. Yeah. The 2015 season, he was kind of their second tight end. He ended up catching 6 touchdown passes that year. So it was a sign that he was going to be something special, maybe as a senior. And then he did start his senior year pretty well. CJ Beathard, who became a 3rd-round pick of the 49ers, and he got to be NFL teammates with, was the quarterback. But then Kittle had an injury at Purdue, a lower leg injury, ended up dealing with plantar fasciitis. They kind of misdiagnosed it. So he basically, the second half of the year, he was either playing hurt or out of the lineup. And so, yeah, he ends up with, like you said, 48 career catches. I looked it up, Doug, and his worst season in the NFL was 2020, when he only played 8 games and he had 48 catches for the 49ers that year. So played a half an NFL COVID season, basically. And then that was his worst year in the NFL. So he's obviously, a 1,000-yard receiver this year, $15 million a year, whatever he's making. So, but yeah, he was sort of, you thought he was going to be good as a senior. And then he just ended up being hurt the whole second half of the year. Basically comes in against Nebraska on senior day, super hobbled, like he could barely move, and did catch like 2 touchdown passes. Okay. I think he had like 2 catches for 4 yards and 2 touchdowns. So it was like, get him in the game, catch a touchdown on senior day, whatever. And he pretty much hates Nebraska to this day, by the way. So he loves beating the Huskers. So anyway, that was, it was sort of like unspectacular. But then, Doug, he has like a monster combine. And so then I was like, oh my God, like, this guy's a freak athletically. Like, why didn't then of course the Iowa fans like, why didn't we use it more? Still to this day, there's a lot of people like, God, how did we not use George Kittle more while he was at Iowa? And now you wonder why Greg Davis got fired as OC.
That's right.
I know we're probably not going to talk about the next OC that.
We're not allowed to have
sorry,
discussions about Iowa on this show.
Sorry to bring that up. But anyway,
there's a cease and desist letter that has been sent my way. No, I'm just kidding. So he's a 5th-round pick of the 49ers. What is Iowa like now? And I want to talk about the history of Iowa tight ends under Kirk Ferentz, but what has it mattered to Iowa football? Or how do people talk about it when you have a guy who, again, maybe wasn't putting up huge stats at Iowa, but is a superstar in the NFL? What does that do for Iowa football, do you think? Yeah,
it's funny. Like, I feel like a lot of Iowa fans, and maybe didn't even necessarily weren't huge fans in 2014, 15, 16. Like, they don't even remember Kittle that much because he didn't do that much. But you romanticize him. You're like, yeah, he's a Hawk. And, he loves Iowa. He always is talking about tight end U. I think he basically created tight end U and has that camp or whatever in Nashville where he lives. And so he was kind of the first to kind of regenerate tight end U. Like Dallas Clark way back when with Peyton Manning became like a superstar. I mean, Kittle to me is kind of dwarfed what even Dallas Clark has done. But since then, you've had Noah Fant, TJ Hawkinson, both in the 19 draft. So 2 years later, were 1st-round picks. And of course, Hawkinson has become a pretty, I think the highest paid tight end in the NFL now for the Vikings. Fant's been okay. He played for the Broncos, now the Seahawks. And then this past year, as you know, Sam Laporta just had a dynamic year. Another one of those guys that, man, he had 1 touchdown catch last year, Doug, for that vaunted Iowa offense, and he had 10 for the Lions this year. So I think Kittle and Laporta were the 2, all-pro NFC tight ends. So it does sort of Kittle kind of restarted it, I guess is what I'm saying.
So there has been this run. Kirk Ferentz, since 1999, when he took over at Iowa, he has had someone who would become an NFL tight end on every single one of his teams. Now, Dallas Clark, the one year, like there's a one little crossover, like in 01, Dallas Clark, I guess, like playing linebacker and special teams, and they moved him to tight, but it still counts. It still counts. So this, and it's not, Laporta is a second rounder, Hockenson and Fant as first rounders since Kittle went in the fifth round. But CJ Fedorowicz, Tony Moiaki, Brandon Myers, Scott Chandler, Tony Jackson, Eric Jensen, Dallas Clark, Austin Wheatley. What is there something? And even though like they didn't use Kittle to the max for circumstance and other reasons, what is it? Is there something about Iowa's recruitment of tight end bodies and guys who can be molded into that? Is it something about their particular development of that position? Is there something about the way Kirk Ferentz, for as much criticism as Iowa offense gets, is there something about the way they want to run offense that they utilize tight ends? 12 NFL tight ends drafted in the Kirk Ferentz era is pretty nuts. Why?
Yeah, I think you touched on a little bit there, Doug. Let's start with recruiting because number one, they don't ever recruit wide receivers well. So they kind of have to build around their strengths, right? So tight ends become their strengths, but how do they develop these guys? Well, in Iowa, like you can find a lot of kids that are 6'3", 215 pounds, 6'4", 220 in high school, and you can develop them. That's kind of one of the best parts about the Iowa program is the way they've developed guys. Their strength program has always been pretty good. George Kittle, as I referenced in that article, he went from 6'2". He tipped the scales at 6'2", 201 when he reported at Iowa in June of 2012. He left Iowa at about 250, and he's actually playing in the NFL about 12 to 14 pounds lighter than he did at Iowa. So he's a little bit more nimble. So it just gives you a sense of they really focus on these guys to develop them. Your buddy Jim Lachey, his son plays for the Hawkeyes, Luke Lachey, and he's going to be the next NFL tight end. He returned for his senior year. He had an unfortunate broken ankle and lower leg in the third game this year. Here he would have probably been, potentially first team All Big Ten this year. So he's the next one. Eric All was pretty good. Former Michigan tight end was pretty good this year for the Hawkeyes until he was lost for the season. So I think it's the development, it's the body types they can get. And, Kirk Ferentz is an offensive line coach, so they've always been pretty good about teaching how to block. So their tight ends typically are good blockers. George Kittle is a really good blocker and kind of a fierce blocker in that sense and kind of a wide receiver type of body.
Is it at the point now they just got a commitment in the last week from Thomas Meyer, a 4-star tight end. Is this a thing now? Like, can they go out and sell this? Is Iowa selling Kittle and Laporta and Fant and Hockenson and saying like, hey, not just like developmental dude, but if you are a big time high school tight end who wants to make it to the league, come here.
Yeah, for sure. That's kind of, what they do a lot of positions, a handful of positions really well. Tight end is one of them. Defensive back has become one of them. As you know, Cooper DeJean was the Big Ten defensive back of the year. They've had a lot of Big Ten defensive backs of the year. If you go back to Riley Moss, Josh Jackson, Amani Hooker, Desmond King, Micah Hyde, and I think there was one other, Dane Belton. He was the other one. So a lot of guys that went to the NFL at that position. But tight end's probably the other one they do really well. So they definitely have sold that. There was a guy from Council Bluffs, Iowa, which is right on the Nebraska border, Thomas Fedone, who ended up going to Nebraska. So they did lose him. He was like one of the top tight ends in the country. Fedone is doing pretty well for the Cornhuskers now, but it is certainly always notable when Iowa, you see which guys Iowa selects as their tight ends. Interestingly, Laporta, and I know we're talking about Kittle, they brought in 3 tight ends that year, and he was the afterthought. He was the third tight end of that year out of in Illinois. Lovie Smith, was the coach at that point, didn't recruit him. He didn't recruit, and he was like from the.
That's why Lovie Smith's not the coach there anymore.
The St. Louis area, like he would have probably gone to Illinois, but Iowa, was the only Power 5 school for Laporta. So it's as you know, recruiting not an exact science, at least in Iowa. At Ohio State, it's a little bit different, but certainly tight ends are an interesting recruiting deal.
When you and I just always think this is fascinating. Just like when you're around a player, when fans get to know a player, and then especially when maybe he does even more in the NFL than he did in college. Like, what have you thought as George Kittle? So, okay, he got hurt. He went nuts at the combine, but then he became George Kittle. Like, as you have watched this, can you not believe it? Do you think back and say, I remember this skinny third string tight end? What have you thought of everything he's become?
Yeah, interesting question. I would say I hadn't of all the guys on that team, like he had like so much personality, and that was kind of in that story, Doug, that you referenced. Like his dad and his mom talked about it. Like Iowa really, especially under Chris Doyle, the former strength coach, really kind of tried to diffuse personalities. Hey, we're all part of the team. Nobody's bigger than the team, and George was a little bit of a partier. He had like a personality, and so when we did get to talk to him. And again, he wasn't always there, but he was great with the media. He was like, his personality like shined, and it was like, oh my God, can we talk to you every week? And then of course, they bring him like once every 5 weeks, but, and so I ended up having a pretty good relationship with him since. And we did, so after Iowa games, every time I do a post-game podcast, and we always do 3-word headlines. Like, hey, it's always, we get like 500 responses. George Kittle still submits 3-word headlines for some Hawkeye games to me, which I love. And it's usually, awesome. Usually for the Nebraska game. So, but
are all his headlines "Suck it, Huskers"?
I should have done some good research and found some of them. Yeah. But yeah, it's usually tight end you or something like that. Yeah, but anyway, so and we kind of like I kind of was one of those guys was like, God, they got to use George Kittle more until he got hurt. And I was like, why aren't you using George Kittle? Like, he's good. And so in a way it was kind of validated. And he did have some unfortunate injury luck at Iowa, but at the same time, I do feel like he was underutilized here.
Kyle Shanahan figured it out.
Yeah. A little bit different. Yeah. Different offensive mind, I guess.
Stylistically, a little different there. Well, this is like, and again, like, these are the stories that are kind of fun that as Northern fan bases have their guys and then their guys, then you get to share them with the world. And it's like, hey, Iowa fans maybe knew what was up with George Kittle, and then he was sprung on the rest of the football universe. And so now everybody, when you're watching the Super Bowl, you'll know the background of George Kittle. And I can't recommend it enough if you want even more on this. Again, to go on the old Google machine and find this story at hawkcentral.com inside George Kittle's transformation from solid Iowa player to 49ers superstar. Chad, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us here on Kings of the North. I think down the line, I can imagine a show where we do like best position groups in the North or something like that. And Iowa tight ends would be very high on that list. We might have to have you back for that one.
That sounds good. And I don't know if you'll be at the Iowa at Ohio State game this next fall, but I'll definitely see you there. If not at Big Ten Media Days. So
we're going to be all over the place. So we will look forward to it. And Chad, thanks so much for your time here on Kings of the North.
You bet. Anytime, Doug. Thanks.
All right. Time to talk Isiah Pacheco with a good friend, Steve Politi of NJ.com. Steve, you've been covering Rutgers football and everything that matters in New Jersey for how long now?
Since 1869. No, first game. Just kidding. 25 years of Rutgers football so far.
And Isiah Pacheco is the best single Rutgers athlete. Now, we don't want to overdo it here. How good was Isiah Pacheco at Rutgers in your mind? What did you think watching that guy play?
I mean, he was a very good running back. You have to keep it in the context of where he was in Rutgers football history, a very kind of dark time for him. So I don't know that we really understood how good of a professional athlete he'd be because, he's running behind a bad offensive line on a bad football team with a bad quarterback. So I don't think we quite appreciated the level he would get to. Certainly when you look at Rutgers from the last 25 years, Ray Rice is the player who stands out as the best player of this generation. Obviously a great college running back, almost 5,000 yards, went on to have an all-pro career until obviously what happened off the field. He's kind of the standard bearer for that. But I think Pacheco is kind of right in that next tier now.
So coming out of high school, he is A pretty high 3-star recruit, 247 composite in the class of 2018. He's the number 17 New Jersey player, the number 30 overall running back, number 665 overall player. I don't know. This seems to me from afar to be the kind of guy that, like, that's the kind of guy that Rutgers wants to make sure they keep home. A Jersey kid who's pretty darn good. I don't know. Was he an example of that? Like, it was like, hey, it was a good job by Rutgers making sure he stayed home.
Yeah, I don't think he was looked at like a guy that was gonna, Notre Dame might come in and steal, or those are the guys they like. Saquon Barkley was a great example of a guy that Rutgers had a commitment from him, and they could keep him home. It was a big deal. Obviously, Penn State brought him to campus, made an offer, and poof, he's gone pretty quickly. I don't think it was that level of recruit. He's a guy kind of developed into it when he got here, more than a star arriving on campus.
So, as you mentioned, like, kind of at a tough time in Rutgers history, but he played for 4 years. He had at least 100 carries in all 4 of his years at Rutgers, 2018 to 2021, but he never had more than 729 rushing yards. It's funny to look at. I looked at the Big Ten rushing leaders from 2021, his final year. He's 13th in the Big Ten in rushing yards, and now he's the starting running back for the best franchise in the NFL. Did you ever think like, hey, maybe they should use this guy more? Or did it like, okay, so Isiah Pacheco as a senior is 13th in the Big Ten in rushing yards. Did that seem about right to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think they would have loved to use him more, but in most of those games, you go 3 and out a couple times and you're down 21 points to Michigan. Well, guess what? You're going to abandon the running game like every team does. And, I'm sure there were instances where, he had a lot of games where he might have eight carries, 15 yards against some of these better opponents. But he did have these incredible moments. Like, I know he had one against Michigan, I think one against Michigan State, where he'd hit a hole and break off a run, and you're like, wow, you could tell that guy's got some juice. He just didn't have enough of those opportunities, didn't have enough blocking, not just from the line either. I mean, I think what the Chiefs do, they're pretty good blocking overall the field. The receivers block well too. Tight ends block well. He just didn't have many holes like that where he could have big games. I think you would see that he'd have one big run, and then you look at the rest of the stats and it'd be like, well, here's one for 2 yards, 1 yard, minus 2 yards, all that,
The way he runs now, it's like everybody in the NFL talks about it. It's talked about it since he got into the league, that he just runs like he's on fire. Like, did he run like that at Rutgers? Did he run like, man, I'm the hardest runner in the world? Absolutely. Yeah, that was his style. And that was his style, I guess, from his days in Vineland, New Jersey. His nickname is Pop. And it's not because he's old or older soul. It's because when he ran into players at the Pop Warner field, it made a popping sound. And that just became, he hit the defensive players, even as a small kid, made a different noise than the other players. So they called him Pop. But yeah, that's always been him. He's just always been a really ferocious, getting chased by a guy with a gun kind of running back. It's just his style. Yeah, that's cool. So it's I always think like it's one of these things when you're around a college football program a lot and sort of what's up with the guy, and then the world gets to know that guy. And you're sort of like, well, I already knew that. If you've been paying attention, you would have known that. But B, it's also like, oh, cool. Now the world gets to see, for me, like, I think that a lot with CJ Stroud, right? Like he took the NFL by storm as a rookie quarterback. It was like, well, he was doing that at Ohio State. When Isiah Pacheco started to do this in the NFL, like in the back half of his rookie year, a couple of seasons ago, what did you think to yourself? Did you think that's that guy? Or were you like, I can't believe this? No. It was a great moment on Monday Night Football where Chris Collinsworth is going on and on about, they got this guy in the 7th round. I have no idea how that was possible. I'm like, no, Chris, I know how that was possible. Like I say, I understand why he only went in the 7th round, because he didn't have, there's nowhere to judge him. He just didn't have that level of tape that a running back and a great team would. But yeah, we knew he was talented. I don't know that I would have expected this much this soon, I guess is one way to look at it. Like, I mean, certainly, one thing to catch fire, win the Super Bowl when you're a rookie. Now in a lot of ways, and this is going to sound crazy with a team with Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce, I get it, but in a lot of ways, he's kind of the engine of that team. I mean, it's not a stretch to say that the Chiefs don't have great receivers. Mahomes is still Mahomes, Kelce's still Kelce, but
late in those playoff games, they're feeding Pacheco. Man, he won that. He's the one putting those games away. He's a really important player for them now. And I guess I would be a little surprised that he's gotten to that point this soon, but that's how it works in the NFL. You kind of find you have to be lucky to find the right place, the right fit, and he's done it.
This is a Northern football show, Steve. So I don't mean to couch everything in terms of North versus South, but I also might say something like the Chiefs drafted an LSU running back in the first round 2 years ahead of Isiah Pacheco, who really hasn't done anything to help them win. And the 7th round Rutgers guy is like the 5th most important guy on the team. If I wanted to make it North versus South, I could point out something like that. What does this mean to Rutgers? Like, is this one of those? Do they have Isiah Pacheco billboards up in the hallway? Like when New Jersey kids, like you could be the. What does it matter to a program like Rutgers when you have a guy doing this?
It's very important. And he was at the game. They played Michigan State at home on homecoming. He came back and he was able to go to the game. And when they came from behind and won, there's this great video of him in the middle of the locker room dancing. He's a big dancer. He's got a great personality, and all the players were around him, dancing with him. And it really was like, all right, well, this is the kind of stuff you put on social media that you want, young players to see on TikTok. He has become, the guy for them. And it's interesting. Rutgers has a reputation as, all right, maybe they're not, certainly not Ohio State for placing guys in pros, but they've had a decent run. They had Gus Edwards and the Ravens was the other running back. So they have both running backs in the AFC Championship game. Wow. They've got a couple of guys, Logan Ryan, a couple of guys on the San Francisco roster as well. The McCourtys for years, Jason and Devin McCourty carried them through a million Super Bowl appearances. And Rutgers has been very smart in capitalizing that and making sure the players, recruits see this, that it's not just, you don't have to go to Michigan to get to the NFL. You can stay in New Jersey. And that's been a very important message they've tried to get across.
What is Schiano's role in this? Like, is it just you're the coach of a program and every program has a couple good guys, or does Greg Schiano have an ability to maybe help guys, the right kind of guy, get ready for the NFL?
I mean, that's certainly that's a big part of his selling pitch he makes that part of what he puts out there. And we develop guys, he likes to talk about Rutgers as being a quote unquote developmental program. And it's not that he's taking a guy who's 5 stars and getting him ready. It's taking, Devin McCourty was a 2-star recruit, taking guys like that and polishing them and making them into ready for the next level. And I think that's something that's important to the identity of the Rutgers program. It's something he uses in recruiting. And it's a big deal. Yeah, absolutely. When he can, and this, you got to remember, this was not, Pacheco was not a Schiano recruit. He came in when Chris Ash was here, the predecessor. So it's a guy he can't take credit for finding, but certainly, they're going to take credit for developing.
Look at you giving Chris Ash some love.
Why not?
So magnanimous.
This guy's unemployed in Las Vegas. He just got fired after the regime change up there. So he needs a little love right now.
So this history of Rutgers running back, should the NFL be on alert for Kyle Monangai, who is back at Rutgers for another year, but who finished higher in the Big Ten rushing standings than Isiah Pacheco ever did? I don't know. Like, hey, Rutgers backs, NFL, pay attention.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of a funny little storyline. But I talked to Kyle Monangai about that, and he hopes so. I mean, this is one reason why he's coming back. He wants to, kind of prove to people that great 1 year wasn't a fluke. Obviously, he's the Big Ten's leading rusher. You don't get there by accident. It was a focus. They were a run-first offense, but he's a really good player. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if he has the, maybe the physical attributes of Pacheco, but I mean, he certainly runs a lot like Ray Rice. He's a powerful, he hits a hole, goes, he can be shifty. I think if he develops more into the passing game, I mean, I certainly think he can play on Sundays. And I think that's going to be part of what the priority is going to be. And they've actually got a couple other good running backs in that program too. Sam Brown, who was shaken off an injury last year, is really talented. And so I think that's a position of strength, certainly for this team.
What are the Rutgers vibes right now? Coming off Pinstripe Bowl win over Miami, guys like Monangai, some guys, staying in school. Gavin Wimsatt at quarterback and bringing in a transfer like Ethan Kaliak-Manis. Like, how is everybody feeling?
Yeah, this is the feeling that this could be a pretty important year for this program. They go 7-6. That's a good starting point for something. But virtually everybody who could have come back with the exception of Max Melton, who probably will be drafted as a cornerback. Everyone who could have come back did come back, which is a big statement in this, especially this day and age where, no one everyone going someplace. So the fact that they, the players decide to come back. The other big thing is that the schedule softens a degree. There's no Ohio State, Michigan, or Penn State on that schedule this year, which is a big deal because Rutgers is 1-29 against those three teams since getting into the league. I get it. It's not that big when you're getting Washington and Southern Cal and UCLA. And instead, that's still easier. I mean, it's not, it might not seem it, but it's still, at least you're not getting your heads beaten in Columbus. So I think there's a feeling that the schedule might shape out where they could maybe get to 8 wins. And, that might be the ceiling for this team. Okay. And if they can do that and get to a really good bowl, then hey, that's a great year.
That is a great year. All right. He's Steve Politi. You can read his Super Bowl coverage all week and always just interesting, wonderful stuff about Rutgers and everything happening in Jersey and New York sports. Read him at nj.com. Steve, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for joining us here on Kings of the North.
Thank you.
Joined now by Eric Hansen. He's the king of South Bend. That's what everybody calls him there. He's been covering Notre Dame sports forever. You can find his work at InsideNDSports.com. Eric, good to see you again. Thanks for coming here to join us on Kings of the North.
Thanks for having me.
So we're talking about Drue Tranquill, who is going to be playing in the Super Bowl. Former Notre Dame defender. Dude, he played so many snaps at Notre Dame between 2014 and 2018, according to PFF. 2,791 defensive snaps. He's now a linebacker for the Kansas City Chiefs. Dude, this guy was on the field constantly for half a decade in South Bend.
He was, and at different positions too. He's such an interesting story because he was going to play college baseball and try to be a Major League Baseball player. And so he didn't get recruited maybe as hard as a lot of athletes that are that caliber because people just thought he was going to play baseball. He injured his back. It seems odd that you're too injured to play baseball and yet you can play football. But he was committed to Purdue, and Notre Dame kind of poached him. Brian Kelly said it's the one guy that I really had to stand on the table for, and I had a minority opinion about somebody, and I won that battle. So He recruited Drue Tranquill. He goes, I don't know what position he'll play, but I want him on my team. And he was originally a safety with one of the worst defensive coordinators that Notre Dame has ever had, Brian Van Gorder, ends up becoming a kind of a hybrid rover and then moved inside to linebacker and really found his stride. And when Brian Kelly had the real bad season in 2016, 4-8, I said, who was the player that was most central in the renaissance, the turnaround in Notre Dame? He said, Drue Tranquill.
Wow.
He said, everything started with him.
That is unbelievable. There's a headline out there that people can find on the Google machine that you wrote, the top 10 surprise players of the Brian Kelly era of Notre Dame football. And again, Brian Kelly obviously has moved on to LSU. And as you were looking back on that, Eric, and Drue Tranquill's number one on that list, was he, as you watched him play, was he dominant defensively with all these snaps he played? Was he more like a glue guy who sort of like, he was part of the, led the Renaissance because he kept the locker room together? What was his greatest impact in South Bend?
Yeah, well, when he finally became consistently healthy, he tore his ACL at the end of his freshman year, tore his ACL still as a safety 3 games into his sophomore year, celebrating a pass breakup he had in the end zone. Jumped up, bumped chest with his teammates, came down, torn ACL. And then Mike Elko, who's now the head coach at Texas A&M, came in as defensive coordinator. He had this rover concept, and that was kind of the beginning of him being an impact player. And it just got more and more. But, yeah, it was the locker room stuff, too, in that, there was so much negativity after the 4-8 season. Brian Kelly basically cleaned house with assistant coaches. But Drue Tranquill was the guy that really was not only the glue, but he had the production on the field too. Inside linebacker was his kind of home. And it's funny that a safety ends up as an inside linebacker, and that's his natural spot, but that really worked well for him. They ended up his last year being a playoff team. It was the first year Notre Dame got to the college football playoff, and he was a big reason.
What it's so interesting. A place like Notre Dame with the history, and obviously there have been rough times at Notre Dame. What was that down year like at Notre Dame? And when you're talking about a guy like Tranquill, who's so important to getting it turned around, when you have a season like a 4-8 season at Notre Dame, was it like, well, that's it? Like Brian Kelly is going to be done here. Or was there always optimism that it would get flipped? What's it like when Notre Dame's bad?
It gets ugly.
Okay.
There was a group that took out, I was at the South Bend Tribune at the time. They took out a full page ad wanting to get rid of Brian Kelly and Jack Swarbrick, the athletic director, for not firing him. And there was a lot of heat, a lot of rumors. And after the season, Brian Kelly had 93 exit interviews with players, mostly players that were coming back, some that were leaving, and they ripped him. Quentin Nelson, who's an all-pro with the Colts now, said, "You don't even know who we are." And Brian Kelly said, "Man, not only do I need to get rid of some assistants, I need to reinvent myself." And so he became much more accessible to players. And it was ugly. And I was one of the people that said, I think there's something here we're salvaging with Brian Kelly. And man, that was a rough off season for me until they started winning again, because that was an unpopular position to take. So yeah, it gets very ugly when Notre Dame has losing seasons. The 3-9 season under Charlie Weiss, it wasn't so much the fans that were on me. It was Charlie Weiss hated me during that 3-9 season.
Because it was your fault. Come on.
It was my fault.
What are you doing, man? Charlie needs some help. So when you look at this, it's remarkable. So that 4-8 year for Brian Kelly in 2016, this is what Notre Dame has done since then. 10-3, 12-1, 11-2, 10-2, 11-2, 9-4, 10-3. Like Notre Dame is back. Notre Dame is finishing in the top 25 at the end of 7 straight seasons, and they make the transition from Brian Kelly, who hands it, it's a handoff to Marcus Freeman, who Brian Kelly had brought in. What a different world it had. You were right. That's why you're the king of South Bend. You were right. You were right for Notre Dame to stick with Brian Kelly, and then you end up being able to hire somebody like Marcus Freeman from a position of power instead of trying to find somebody to resurrect the program. You want to take a lap? What do you want to do? Come on, man.
Well, and Drue's, it was interesting because if you had said up until his 2017, is he going to play in the NFL? We thought, well, maybe a special teams guy, maybe. The rover position was very new to college football at that time. And the way Mike Elko and then Clark Lee, his successor, used it is a little bit different than Marcus uses it. It really was a hybrid position for a guy that couldn't get on the field as a safety, couldn't get on the field as a linebacker, but had some skills. Now, I'll tell you, the guy that the first recruit, Drue Tranquill, was the first guy to play it for Notre Dame. The first guy they recruited to play it and played it beautifully was Jeremiah Owusu-Koroma, who's now at the Browns.
Yep.
That's what they had in mind of the rover when they created that position. But Drue Tranquill played it for 1 year, and they said, wait a minute, we think this guy can play in the NFL. He wants to play in the NFL, and we'll move him inside for his last year so that he has a shot at that. And he was tremendous. And again, they went to the playoff that year, and he was a big reason why. And again, the whole culture kind of revolved around him. Even to this day, if you ask Brian Kelly, who changed everything, the first name out of his mouth will be Drue Tranquill.
Well, and that's one of those things. And I think a lot of head coaches have guys like that, whether maybe it was someone at the beginning of their tenure who's a foundational guy who sort of showed other players the ropes or had that coach's back early on, or whether it's in the midst of a tough stretch. Those coaches will never stop talking about those guys, those foundational guys. And so I think that's about as good of a description, if people are not familiar with Drue Tranquill, that he's a guy. Brian Kelly's in South Bend for a decade, but like Drue Tranquill is at the top of his list of like, this guy helped make my career what it is, help Notre Dame be what I wanted Notre Dame to be.
If Brian Kelly has grandchildren someday, he should name the first one Drue and spell it like Drew does.
Drue. I love it. So okay. So this guy is vital to what Notre Dame is doing. He's a leader on a playoff team in 2018. He's a 4th round pick in 2019 of the Chargers. I am sometimes good at this, sometimes terrible at this when I'm trying to evaluate guys that I've covered a lot. How are they going to do in the NFL? There have been some very good players. There's one that comes to mind to me is like Sam Hubbard was a defensive end at Ohio State that in the course of his career, it was like, is he going to be a safety? Is he going to be a tight end? Is he going to be a defensive end? He was a very good, productive player at Ohio State. I didn't know how he was going to fit in the NFL. And I thought he might fall between the cracks. And instead, he's a foundational player on a Bengals team that has made the Super Bowl. Sam Hubbard's an awesome NFL player. Did you think Drue Tranquill would be a great NFL player? Or when you're talking about some of these hybrid positions, did you think there was a chance he'd fall through the cracks?
I thought because of his perseverance, everything he had been through, and his character, he would stick in the NFL, but I didn't necessarily think he was going to be an impact player. I wasn't sure if he had all the athleticism and everything that he needed, that he would evolve into that. We hadn't seen him at inside linebacker for that long, but just, playing through injuries that when he tore his first ACL against Louisville in 2014, he finished the game. He played most of that game with a torn ACL. And his 5th year, he got hurt mid-season and had an injury and played through that injury. I think he might have missed a game. But then he came back and played through the injury. So you knew that there was going to be perseverance, that, you were going to have to drag him out of the NFL kicking and screaming. But he has been more impactful. And I think the Chargers, landing with the Chargers was a good landing spot at that time. The Chargers took a lot of Notre Dame guys. They drafted Alohi Gilman, who was a safety later on for Notre Dame. They drafted Manti Te'o when he was kind of radioactive coming out of college, and Jerry Tillery. So the Chargers was a good landing spot. And now with the Chiefs, now he can hang out with Taylor Swift.
Lucky him. That's what he always was dreaming of in South Bend. Someday Taylor Swift.
He's probably one of the few guys that wasn't, just from the standpoint. I think he was married pretty early, and he's a very loyal family man.
Yeah. Okay. So this is his first year with the Chiefs. There's been a lot of discussion about the Chiefs signing him in free agency. Played more than 1,000 snaps with the Chargers last year, like a really important part. I think maybe it seems like the Chiefs maybe signed him to be sort of like an in-between kind of fill in the gaps kind of role. Then they had some injuries. He's played maybe more at linebacker than they expected. But it's funny, Andy Reid was talking about him, Eric, and one of the things he said, thank goodness he's a really smart guy. He put that Notre Dame education to use in learning this whole thing, and he did it quickly. Yes, Notre Dame, hang that on a wall somewhere, right? Don't you love hearing Andy Reid talking about smart Notre Dame dudes?
Yeah. Well, he is smart. He picked things up really well, and I do think his background as a safety really helped him become a better linebacker. The game changed a lot from when we think about how football was played in the early 2010s and what linebackers look like to what they have to do now with so much pass coverage, even the inside guys. Him having that safety background really, really helps him and really rounds him out as a player.
Has he been back around at all? Sometimes one of these things when you have like an impact like this on a program, it's like you're treated as a hero when you come home. Does he ever show back up for a spring game or something?
You'll see him every once in a while for during a bye week. He'll come back, and he's beloved. I think people understand. I don't know to the depths they understand what a pivotal player he was, but they know that he was on that playoff team. They know how resilient he was, and how much bad luck he played through. And if they were retiring numbers, which they can't do at Notre Dame because there would be no numbers left.
Right.
I think Brian Kelly would certainly pitch for that, just because he's a big reason Notre Dame. I mean, again, in 2017, there were times to get negative. They were 10-3 that year, but they got blasted out of the water at Miami in a really ugly road loss. And they had to kind of pull back together, and he was the guy that kind of helped pull them back together. And you had great leaders on that team. You had Mike McGlinchey, you had Quentin Nelson, but Drue Tranquill was the guy. And so it'll be interesting to see what his post NFL career is like, if he gets into coaching or some kind of leadership. I'd hire him in a second to lead my company.
He's Eric Hansen. You can find his work at InsideNDSports.com as part of the Rivals Network. Great insight on Drue Tranquill, man. We just want people, you're watching the Super Bowl with your friends, and now, you know, you can lean over and elbow and say, hey, Drue Tranquill, da-da-da-da-da. Just, like, Eric, you don't care if people steal your information and regurgitate it.
I don't care if they
right?
steal my information from this podcast. Not at all.
Thanks. Yeah, that's what we're here for. Eric, thanks so much for joining us here and giving us some great insight on Drue Tranquill here on Kings of the North.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so thanks to Chad and to Steve and to Eric for that. Two Ohio State guys in this game, Landis, and you and I covered them both.
Mm-hmm.
What Nick Bosa and Chase Young have become in the NFL, they were both number 2 picks in the draft in consecutive years. Nick Bosa in 2019, Chase Young in 2020. Nick Bosa has been one of the best defensive players in the NFL. Chase Young kind of didn't work out in Washington, got traded to the Niners in the middle of this year. Are you surprised that Nick Bosa has been this dominant? And are you surprised that Chase Young has had a little bit of trouble getting his feet under him?
Not surprised at all by Nick Bosa, and surprised that Chase Young is not a similar player. We had a conversation about that on our Ohio State podcast, and someone did point out that I guess Chase Young has had some injury, bad luck in his career that we didn't talk about at the time, so that's worth mentioning, and clearly I think a factor in Chase Young probably not quite realizing the potential people thought he would have in the NFL. So yeah, that part of it is surprising, but no, not surprised at all by Nick Bosa. Like Nick Bosa, when he came to Ohio State, following the footsteps of his brother Joey Bosa, like was described to us as like a better athlete than Joey, but also someone who benefited greatly from like watching Joey and learning from Joey, and even like picking up some things from Larry Johnson, Ohio State's defensive line coach, before Nick ever got to Ohio State. So Nick was like a more advanced form of Joey Bosa, only because genetic lottery, he was born after him. So, but no, not surprised at all that he has been one of the more dominant defensive presences in the league.
I would have said that Chase Young will be a better NFL player than Nick Bosa. I wondered a little bit about like Nick's sort of like bendability and flexibility. Is like, I just always thought of him as a little more power, but he's just, every time, I love the way Nick Bosa lines up. He just looks like he's going to fire off the line like a maniac and get after you. And I just will never forget this. It really reminds me of, it's like the Ohio State version of Venus and Serena Williams. That it's like the first one comes along and it's like, wait till you see the next one.
Yeah.
And then the next one is like, holy moly. And just like so vividly, I remember covering Ohio State at a practice in 2013 when the Buckeyes were playing in the Orange Bowl. And that's the area where the Bosas are from. And so, you know, we were there at practice, and Chris Carter, the great Ohio State legend who had coached at the high school where the Bosas went to, was like, man, wait till you see the brother. And then Nick came to practice, and I like was interviewing 10th grade Nick Bosa in the parking lot after Joey Bosa finished a practice from his freshman year. And it was just like, oh yeah, no, I think I'm going to, I like Ohio State or whatever. And now to think of what they've become, like, it's just one of those things. The Bosas were just right. I mean, their dad and their uncle were both first-round NFL draft picks, both defensive ends. They remind me of LeBron James in some way, of like they sort of have every athletic advantage that you would want, but then so much is expected of them that when people live up to their own hype and their hype is through the roof, you have to acknowledge, like, man, you knew they were going to be great, but they're great. And that, like, wait till you see the little brother absolutely turned out to be true. So what Nick Bosa went from, chasing Joey around to what he is now is, you got to acknowledge it, man.
This is in your book that you read about Ohio State recruiting. One of the two of them needed more convincing to go to Ohio State, right? Which one was it?
So it is in my recruiting book, which people can find at their local library. Nick, so the mom, Cheryl, she went to Ohio State. So her brother is Eric Kumro, and so they're from the Chicago area. He was going to go to Illinois, and then he was interested in Ohio State, and she was like, she was a year older, I think, and she said, like, I'll transfer to Ohio State if you want to go there. So then they both wound up going to Ohio State. And Nick, she said, growing up, Nick loved Ohio State, and like Joey was anti-Ohio State, kind of just to be against his mom. So their dad, John, went to Boston College, and like Boston College, like John's like, hey man, Boston College never really like showed much interest in recruiting. So new BC coach, like, hey, if you got bloodlines there, even if you think you can't get the guy, go after him. Joey took some convincing, and then Urban Meyer and like Larry Johnson kind of worked their magic. And Nick was like, I love the Buckeyes from the jump.
Yeah, which is fascinating. I want to say too, like, like we said, like Chase Young has not had as much NFL success as Nick Bosa, but if you want to talk about like someone who was billed as being awesome, like the next big thing and backing it up, like Chase Young more than backed it up in college. Oh, he was the 100%. Best defensive player in college football in 2019.
He was a legit Heisman candidate.
I can't remember. I don't think I had a vote that year, but I think I would have voted for him that year.
Because he got suspended for 2 games for like kind of that weird stuff that people used to get suspended for. And I think if he hadn't gotten suspended, he might have made a run at it. So
I think he would have had 20 sacks if he didn't get suspended. I think he ended up with 16 and a half or so that year.
Yeah.
But like had dominant, like that Wisconsin game was crazy. But he had 4 sacks in that game. And like the image of him like holding his arms out and like looking to the sky as the rain is falling on him. It's like an iconic Ohio State shot. So I guess I'm just mentioning that because like I don't want people to think that like Chase Young has come up short of his potential like throughout his entire career. Like there's a reason he was a number 2 pick in the draft. It's because when he was at Ohio State, even as a sophomore, he had 10 sacks as a sophomore. I think like he was a dominant player at Ohio State. It just hasn't clicked for him quite the same way in the NFL.
No, I really think like to make a list of like, I've never seen that before in my 20 years almost of covering Ohio State. I think like my 3 guys at the top of the list might be Ted Ginn Jr., Marvin Harrison Jr., and Chase Young.
Yeah.
Like, as good as everybody is at a place like Ohio State, I've never seen that before.
Right. And and unfortunately for every Ohio State defensive end that's come after Chase Young, that's who they get compared to. It's like, live up to the thing we've never seen before. Yeah.
But now they're together in San Francisco, and it is sort of the thing that was denied Ohio State in 2018 when Nick Bosa got hurt in the first half of the 3rd game, and that was it for his 2018 season when he was a junior and Chase Young was a sophomore, and then Chase Young went nuts in 2019. But they really only got to play like 2.5 games together where they were both like really part of it, because in 2017 when Nick Bosa was great, Chase Young was a freshman and played like 100 snaps or whatever. So nice to see them back together. But they're there now, and there's a lot of Northern guys to watch. So you don't have to watch the Super Bowl thinking about Northern college football players, but if you want to, we hope we gave you a little bit of information to help you enjoy it. So we will catch you guys next week. If you missed our show earlier this week, the ultimate Northern football schedule, we had a fun time thinking about what 2024 this fall is going to be like for Northern football fans, and we have a lot of stuff planned down the road for you. For now, thanks to our producer, Mike Yarostowski. He's Bill Landis. I'm Doug Lesmerises, and that was Kings of the North.